So we're into the early 2000s where now Pavel's basically taking some of the fundamental principles from the Prague School and creating this new discipline. Let's use each of the words to explain to people what this is. So dynamic, of course, is movement, right? It's not just static. It applies to in motion. Neuromuscular, I think, explains the connection between the nervous system, both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, but really, as you said, an emphasis on the central nervous system and how that connects to the muscular system. So a lot of people, I think, assume that acts of strength are purely muscular, and they don't realize the neurologic control of those things. For me personally, the hardest one to explain to an unsuspecting audience is stabilization. Now, I have a way that I like to explain it, but I want to hear you go first.
Okay. So I think it's important to talk about the utilization of developmental kinesiology as a way to explain posture and explain dynamic stabilization. When we're first born, functionally and structurally, we are immature. So our central nervous system is still maturing. Our bones are still forming. The first weeks of life, first 4 to 6 weeks of life, the lower central nervous system structures, the brainstem level is kind of dominant. So primitive reflexes are dominant. But there's
examples of that: suck reflex,
sucking reflex,
grasping,
yeah.
Obviously being able to blink. I mean, the most primitive reflexes that our species, we take these for granted.
So they help keep us alive during that period of time. So as that central nervous system matures, and if it's maturing in a healthy way, by a 3-month period of time, actually, let me go back, usually starting maybe 8 weeks, we start to facilitate the synergy, coordination, and timing of the deep stabilizing group of musculature. And that's diaphragm, pelvic floor, the entire abdominal wall, the intersegmental spinal musculature that runs throughout the entire spine.
All right, I'm going to stop you right here. We are going to talk about these things so much that I want to make sure people understand them. So let's go back to the first one. Everybody's heard of their diaphragm, but let's put some actual metrics to it. It's a dome-shaped muscle. It's a striated muscle, but it has kind of a non-muscular part as well. But I think what most people don't appreciate is how big it is, right?
Yeah.
And how, I can't even remember. It's been, back when I was, in school, I had to know every attachment of it. Right. But it, do you recall how far it attaches down and up on both the ribs and the vertebral bodies?
Yeah. So the diaphragm, just think of it like a big parachute or a big sheath of muscle that separates the abdominal cavity from the heart and lungs. The attachments, it has attachments on the lower 6 ribs, on the back of the xiphoid process, which is a little bone at the end of the sternum, and then also attachments on L1, L2 vertebra. So that's right around the thoracic lumbar junction.
Yeah. So that's just an enormous expanse of attachment. Attachments being, where the muscles attach and anchor, and therefore that gives you a sense of what their lever capacity is, what they can actually contract.
Right. So that there's those attachments, and then there's a central tendon that when the diaphragm activates, so one of the primary functions is respiration. So I go to take a breath in, that diaphragm activates, descends, the central tendon drops, the lungs expand, that change in pressure, you're able to draw air into the lungs, and then there's a recoil of the diaphragm and the air comes out. So there's a primary respiratory function. During the first weeks of development, or ontogenesis, which is the study of motor development after birth, there's primary respiratory function. The central nervous system has not matured to the point to create the synergy within the other deep stabilizing group of musculature to create that fixed point through the trunk and the pelvis. So by around 3 months period of time, that central nervous system has matured to the point where now the hardwired genetic ingrained motor programs start to manifest themselves. So we start to see this coordinated activity of that deep group of musculature.
So so we've now, for me, and I think for many people, a very helpful image is that of a cylinder. Mm-hmm. The strongest possible cylinder, right, would have a big top, a big bottom, and a beautifully symmetric, side compartment to it, right? A lousy cylinder would have a tiny little bottom, a big top, and a dented middle. Mm-hmm. So if the diaphragm formulates the top of that cylinder, what makes up the bottom of that cylinder?
So the bottom of the cylinder, we're looking at the pelvic floor, which is an area of musculature, basically where the babies come out. And that musculature will coordinate the regulation or management of intra-abdominal pressure that is created with the descending of the diaphragm. So the diaphragm, three main functions: respiration, but there's also obviously a huge postural function where it descends even more and creates an intra-abdominal pressure, so that when that pressure is created, the pelvic floor will eccentrically load, meaning it's active, but musculature is active but stretches. You can think of it like wind blowing into a sail, where the wind blows into the sail, it opens and activates, and then it holds and maintains the pressure. But then at the same time, we have the entire abdominal wall, which consists of the rectus muscles, our six-pack muscles, our oblique musculature, which is musculature that crosses the body, comes up and has attachments onto the thoracic cage or the rib cage. And then a big one called transverse abdominis, which wraps around from the back, the thoracolumbar fascia, around to the front. So as that diaphragm descends to facilitate a stabilizing function, that intra-abdominal pressure is created. That musculature reacts to the pressure. There's an eccentric load and then an isometric. And then as we coordinate, so we have respiratory function, postural function, but we have to now coordinate between both respiratory and postural functions. So our central nervous system, our brain, needs to manage that pressure to provide enough stability, but also allow the diaphragm to also allow the lungs to expand. This coordination is usually where we see people kind of falling apart. And if they fall apart, they'll tend towards what Yanda saw, which is that overutilization. So in the lower cross syndrome of the extensor musculature and the flexor musculature, because we lose that synergy of that deep stabilization. And if we lose that synergy and that ability to create that fixed point, then our brains will do their jobs, which is to find a way to still move and do tasks that we need to do. But in doing so, we'll go to more of a high threshold, or like I described, more of a compensatory pattern. So developmentally, that 3-month period of time is where we ideally will have that synergy, coordination, and timing of that deep group of musculature that will allow the infant to create a fixed point through the trunk and the pelvis. And then also with that management of that intra-abdominal pressure, there's a loading on the front of the spine. And with that loading, we get an uprighting effect throughout the spine. So then the intersegmental spinal musculature are eccentrically loading and managing that pressure against the spine to help with that uprighting effect and that unloading effect.
Let's again make sure people know exactly what we mean, because we're going to use the terms a lot. When you talk about eccentrically versus concentrically loading, I mean, to me, the easiest way to define it is just using the definitions, right? So a muscle is concentrically loaded when it's getting shorter as it's being loaded. Eccentrically is getting longer as it's being loaded. So, for example, a bicep curl, this is the concentric phase of loading. This is the eccentric phase of loading.
Yes.
And I think what a lot of people take for granted is both of those are important. But most people, when training, tend to emphasize the concentric and don't realize the eccentric. I heard a great story. I think it was actually from Michael Stromsness, that when a group of US weightlifters visited a group of Eastern European weightlifters, I don't know, maybe it was even you that told this story, they realized that they were counting reps differently. So the American lifters would consider a rep 1 is up and down. So they were putting all their effort into the concentric, but then, more or less dropping the weight on the way down, not really focusing on the effort to put the weight down. And the Eastern European lifters were doing the opposite, right? They were counting it as 2 reps. It's up, 1, down, 2. So it was just as much effort into that eccentric. And, it's not to say one is right or wrong, because they serve different purposes. Obviously, more emphasis on the eccentric will create more hypertrophy. So there are times that you want both. But again, when you look at, for example, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, but when you look at hip abduction, the importance of being able to eccentrically control that is such an important part of injury prevention. And you can spend all the time in the world working on concentrically doing that. So later today, when we actually do some stuff on the mat, you'll have some exercises to demonstrate that.
Yeah. So what the observation, having knowledge of the developmental kinesiology or the ontogenesis, and watching that maturation of the central nervous system, and with that healthy maturation, seeing the synergy of the deep stabilization, providing that fixed point, and then allowing efficient transfer of force and load throughout that trunk and pelvis area. What these pioneers, Vojta, Yonda, Levitt, Collage, noticed was the importance of the quality, basically training that central nervous system. Because if you can facilitate that ideal stabilization, stereotype, and synergy, then you provide what Professor Collage calls centration throughout that chain of movement, throughout that kinematic chain. And what he describes centration as is, for example, let's say you have the hip joint, is the ability to maintain an ideal position of the femur and the acetabulum, which is the hip joint, throughout that full